All right, well, we might kick off. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be in the world. My name is Sarah Nolet, and I'm one of the directors of AusAgritech, the Australian Agritech Association that is bringing you this event here today. I'm also a founder of the Agthentic group, and we are fortunate enough to spend 100% of our time thinking about the sustainable future of food and ag and how technology can play a role in that. So really looking forward to the discussion here this morning. Just in terms of a bit of housekeeping, we will have the chat function going and would love to have some intros from everyone. Just in terms of the chat function, if you can make sure that the little blue box says that you're sending a message to everyone, not just the panelists or not just attendees, but sending that message to everyone, then we'd love to get some intros going. So feel free to say who you are, share a LinkedIn profile or a company organization. We want this to be an interactive and community event, so please use the chat to be doing that. We're really fortunate to have some help in putting on these events. So thrilled to be backed by our sponsor, Food Bites by Rabobank. And you'll hear from Nat in a second about what they're up to. This event was also organized by us as well as SproutX and Platfarm. So SproutX is an agri-tech accelerator in Melbourne, and Platfarm is an ag tech startup based in Adelaide. And Julia and Ollie are in the chat. So if anyone wants to learn more, connect with them. We also have panelists, Lachlan, Olympia, and Jess. You'll hear from them in a second. So we won't get into that yet. But if you want to please introduce yourself, use the chat and make sure that that message does go to everyone. That would be great. So in terms of who's in the room, we would love to know a little bit about who comes to these events and who you guys are and where you hail from. So we'll get a bit of a survey going up while you guys get those intros going. So we'll just give about 30 seconds here to fill that out, as well as put your intro in the chat. Awesome. Great to see some intros coming through. Hey, Justin. Hey, Christina. Hey, Nigel. Awesome. Love to see those intros. And yeah, go ahead and vote and we'll share the results here in a sec in terms of who is in the room. Looks like we are majority sort of corporate agri-food with some entrepreneurs, investors, government, others mixed in. Looks like also not everyone had a chance to vote, which is fair enough. We put that up quickly. But great to have you all here this morning and love that our agri-tech community here is a range of different perspectives. And obviously that's really important. Just a brief update on some of the things happening in the AusAgritech world. Last week was Beef Week, which had record attendance despite international borders being closed. You'll see our AusAgritech chair, Andrew Coppin, with Minister Littleproud there. AgFest was also on in Tassie. And apparently one of the highlights there was hearing that machinery sellers have had to borrow equipment from farmers because they just can't get supply right now. So interesting supply chain challenges there. And that unfortunate picture of me is at South Start, where it was great to see Agritech having a big presence at one of the biggest tech conferences in Australia, and Agritech being featured really strongly. So a really fun week for the ecosystem in terms of being embedded in ag events and tech events across all of Australia. So that's what's been happening with us. As always, we do have our Slack community for AusAgritech. So Tori will put the link in there for everyone to join, but there's a jobs board and community and lots of engagement. I know people have formed partnerships and pilots and hired different people they've met in that community. So please join if you haven't. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nat just to say a couple words about Food Bites.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening where you are today. Just want to touch on our applications and I guess how Food Bites can help you grow your business globally. For those of you that don't know about Rabobank, we have a history of about 100 years in the food and agriculture industry, serving large corporations as well as farmers. The industry, as we all know, is changing more rapidly than ever before, and those large companies can benefit from looking to startups when thinking creatively about improving their own businesses. And on the other side, the startups are growing so quickly that they themselves will be major players in the coming years. And that's where Food Bites comes in, to really create this collaborative platform where the different sides of the food system can connect and build a more sustainable future together. So Food Bites Pitch, which is what our applications are open for at the moment, is our annual multi-week program that helps startups validate and grow their businesses and their impact through global industry exposure, tailored mentorship sessions, individualized strategic connections with corporates, farmers and investors, pitch refinement, media visibility. It's supported by the vast global Rabobank network and a community of mission-driven alumni entrepreneurs. We are looking for startups creating more sustainable supply chains, improving resource management, and developing the next frontier of nutrition. So you can see on the slide here, this is the criteria that we look for. So we have 5 key areas, looking at your team, validated business model, the focus on people, profit, and planet, collaborative mindset, and validation of growth stage business. And you can see our scouting goals below. So we're targeting hopefully over 350 global applications coming in hopefully by the end of this weekend. We're looking at a really diverse group of founders. And then to put in context where we sit, North America is the kind of the top pool, but then we're closely second, so on equal footing with Europe. And I think that's a real testament to the quality of startups that we're seeing here and applying through the platform. The great thing about us being based where we are in APAC is that it will close US Sunday time. So that means Monday morning for us. So for all the startups out there, that means you get an extra evening to do your application before submitting, which is great. We have 3 kind of sector focus areas for applications. You may have seen our innovation report that came out earlier this year, and some of these themes were highlighted. This is just a guide. We're also hoping to obviously uncover some new focus areas and complementary businesses, but some of our alumni are kind of listed on this page too, to give you some ideas of the businesses that have come through the platform in these kind of key areas. So that's sustainable supply chains, improved resource management, and the next frontier of nutrition. And as we move to, what are the benefits for being part of Food Bites for you and your business? All the selected entrepreneurs really gain connections to our corporates, farmers, and investors aligned with your business, the stage and goals that you're at, resulting in productive conversations that open the door for meaningful long-term outcomes. And that can include things like investment, corporate pilots, corporate customer relationships, feedback on your products and technologies and their commercial viability, service provider relationships, insight into corporate resources and viewpoints to help you refine your approach to collaboration, and targeted introductions with other corporate businesses. And I think the last one there on the slide, point 6, that network of fellow mission-driven entrepreneurs. We have an example right now to share with you. We've got 2 startups, one from our cohort in 2020 and one from 2016, both from different regions. They connected through the Food Bites Alumni Network, and they're now doing a pilot with a large corporate in another region. So we have 2 startups, 1 corporate, 3 different countries, working on a pilot virtually at the moment, all via the Food Bites by Rabobank network. And then so join our community. Our applications are open till Sunday. The link's there. You can also join our newsletter group. You can reach out to me or our global team. The emails are there. Our social handles are there. And I think, Tori, I think you're going to probably pop them in the chat for everyone if they want to. And you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. So that's it from us. We hope to see lots of Food Bites applications coming in from this group. We know the talent's there. So I'm really proud to be supporting the Meetup. So back to you, Sarah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nat. And Food Bites has been a great player in the ecosystem. It's actually how I met Olympia and originally back sort of 5 years ago, and continues to bear fruit for those that have participated. So yeah, thanks to Rabobank for sponsoring. Really pleased to have them on board. So we'll jump into a bit of the panel discussion now. Just again, if you're putting anything in the chat, keep those intros coming, send those to everyone. If you do have questions for the panelists, we'll just integrate that into the discussion. We won't wait till the end. So use the Q&A button and just send those through, and I'll filter those and feed them into the discussion. So we'll kick off with some intros from everyone. Lach, we might start with you, just saying a little bit of who you are and sharing what you see as the biggest challenge to sustainable supply chains right now.
Yeah, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thanks very much for tuning in. Yeah, so Lachlan, Monsbourgh, been at Rabobank for 3.5 years, but I actually come from sort of the soft commodity environment, mainly in chocolate and cocoa. So worked 16 years across the tropical belt, and have finally come back to Australia to work in Rabo. And I look after, within the bank, I look after sort of looking at our farmers that we bank, environmental, social, and agronomic footprint, and how can we create opportunities out of that. I think the biggest challenge we've got in sustainable supply chains is metrics, right? How do we translate the actual footprint of farmers into the consumer goods market without basically the emotion that's attached in certification at the moment, where people are making choices, consumers are making choices based on perception of what good actually is, rather than what is actually measured. So that's, yeah, hopefully we've got a couple of minutes to explore that further during the panel.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Lach. Jess, we'll go to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Jess Vieira. I'm the Senior Director of Sustainability at Apeel Sciences. We're a company based in California here in the US. So thank you to everyone over there for getting up early for this. One of the few times an overseas call is actually better for my schedule. So thanks for Sarah to inviting me here. Apeel Sciences, we've developed a plant-derived coating that's applied to fresh fruits and vegetables after they're harvested. This edible coating slows down water loss and oxidation such that the produce lasts twice as long as it would have without the coating. So really our mission, and one of the big sustainable supply chain challenges in the food industry is food waste. And so our product is really focused on how do we address this? How do we reduce waste across the entire supply chain? One thing though that I would love to talk about in this discussion too is not just really this issue of food waste, but incentives throughout the supply chain, especially in highly commoditized industries, and how that actually proliferates waste or the ability to achieve some of these more sustainable outcomes. A little bit about my background for the discussion: environmental engineering by training, and I spent a couple of years working at the Dow Chemical Company, so kind of looking at things from a very different sector and different kinds of supply chains. Have a PhD focused mostly on life cycle assessment, so I love the metrics that Lach is talking about and really taking data-driven approaches to decision making. And then spent a little bit of time also at Apple, working on consumer electronics and how to manage the environmental footprint of, again, a totally different industry before joining Apeel.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. And we'll definitely dig into incentives as well. Olympia, who are you and what's the biggest challenge in sustainable supply chains?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Olympia Yarger. I'm the CEO of Goterra, based here in Ngunnawal country in Canberra. We build waste management infrastructure to deliver food waste management using insects. I come from a conventional agricultural background, mostly sheep and some cattle. I think for us, the thing that's most important when we think about the supply chain and of course where we fit in food waste is sort of both the changes of socioeconomic focuses and then the resiliency of sovereignty of the supply chain when it's linear as opposed to circular, and the need to move to a circular economy I think is recognized, but we've focused primarily on digital solutions, and we are now sort of in a place where we're like, oh, we actually don't have the infrastructure or hardware required to deliver those, like some of the most incredible digital solutions. We still need hardware and infrastructure to have them realized. And I think, so we sort of sit right there in that, like, socioeconomic changes are coming. Who's going to pay? Because it's like, if you're going to reuse things, then their first cost might be more expensive, and then you've got to pay for them more times as you reuse or fix and repair. And then what's going to be needed to realize sustainable supply chains that create regional sovereignty in relation to hardware and infrastructure.
Awesome. Thanks, Olympia. I want to go back to you, Lach, maybe initially just on the what's kind of changing in this space. We like sustainability is something that gets talked about in agriculture, but I've felt like in the last sort of 3 years, especially, there's been this big shift from it being greenwashing or certain, departments in these ag companies thinking about it to really being front of mind. Is that the shift you're seeing, or do I live in fairy tale land?
No, I think you're right, and it's because from bank world, from financial services world, certain things that are going on in the regulatory space means, at least for us, and I probably should stick to my knitting, stick to what I know. At least for us, things that are happening in terms of the pressure that's on central banks to essentially equate financial service providers' footprints and disclose it openly. That means we're forced to have essentially more transparent conversations with our clients about, well, what's actually going on farm, right? And not just from a P&L perspective, not just from a yield perspective, but what are the impacts that that the productivity is causing, and what are the practices that you're using to start to mitigate them. And then on top of that, you've got the whole climate risk thing, which is basically, again, the financial supervisors of the world, the central banks, the financial regulators are starting to ask, okay, well, what does transition look like at certain RCPs for your portfolio, right? So what are the essentially the debt owners of the clients doing to reassure you as the banker that with a 2-degree warming, a 3-degree warming, whatever it might be, that they're not going to go belly up in the process of that transition, right? So, and that requires, all panelists have spoken about it, that requires metrics, right? That to be able to quantify that accurately, that requires metrics. So I think whilst there are some sectors of the industry that are still sort of feeling their way on it, right? It's going to happen, right? The sort of the European Sustainable Finance taxonomy is sort of laid down. There's a whole range of things that are sort of forcing us as financiers to sort of start to work with our clients to quantify this stuff, and also work with other service providers to ag to work out, okay, the farmer probably doesn't want 15 different people coming to them and saying, oh, I need this data, I need that data, I need this data. How can we synergize it a bit better as well?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You talk about the risk side and some of the, like Jesse mentioned, incentives. Is that kind of what you're seeing? A lot of these drivers are coming from a either regulatory or risk perception, or is it coming from like opportunities to make more money, or where are you seeing the push or pull?
Well, that's the balance that we're trying to work out ourselves, because you can't just go to your clients with a big stick, right? They go to another bank, right? So what are the opportunities that are there? And I think back to sort of my intro, all the top FMCG companies in the world have got these targets out to 2050 or 2040 or whatever it is around their footprint, right? Whether it be an emissions footprint, water footprint, or whatever it is, which are metrics based. So how can we create supply chain opportunities that within that to basically meet the market that has been signaled?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. To kind of piggyback off of that, I think, we can't ignore the need to kind of reduce risk and manage things responsibly. There's tons of data out there on the relationship between, strong ESG performance and lack of volatility performance of a business in general. But I think what we're also seeing in the last few years is this huge uptick in, we're a venture capital based or supported company, in venture capitalists looking for opportunities focused in this space too. Food waste is a great example. It costs $2.6 trillion to our global economy, and it's this kind of invisible tax on our food system. It applies in almost every supply chain, every actor deals with it, and it's just something that is baked in. And we kind of view it as not necessarily just a tax, but like an untapped savings account, that if we can figure out ways to unlock that value, we can reinvest in the supply chain in other ways too. And I think there has been this shift of really like not just focusing on, we need to do less bad, but this is an opportunity for innovation that's worth investing in. We have a large partnership with the Kroger company, who's a retailer here in the US, and even they have an innovation fund that this year is solely focused on investing in companies upcycling materials. So, you're kind of seeing it all across the board. And it's so different than when I started in this industry, where, we had to even rebrand some of the programs I worked on to not call them green because of how that might not get traction internally for certain things. And it's just like a total 180 now in terms of support and resources going behind these types of programs.
It's really interesting, just that shift and how the perception of it's changed and therefore the resources behind it. But I guess I still have the sense that a lot of it is aspirational talk and sometimes struggles to get into the action. And maybe that's your kind of point, Olympia, around infrastructure. Like some of the ways we can solve this problem aren't nice reports or nice targets, but actually getting into hardware and infrastructure. Do you want to talk a little bit about your view on what it actually takes?
Yeah, I think that's the next evolution of the challenge, right? So I think everyone's realizing the opportunity, and I love the reframing food waste as a savings account instead of a tax, because most of what I believe around food waste is a symptom of broken supply chains and incentivization towards production, right? And so if we don't have places to put the stuff we're producing, it gets wasted. But if we are going to invest in upcycling and recycling, then those ideas are really great. But what we end up finding is you create a way of doing things that then has no front or back end to deliver or then push it the other way. And so I think what we're actually facing is a really big challenge. It's not undoable, but I think we do have to step into thinking and looking at hardware, because most of the investments are not in hardware. They're in data-driven, SaaS platform-driven plays, which are important. The data is really important, but to deliver on these things, the vertical integration of hardware is going to have to be realized. And I think, when we look at it from a food waste perspective, you've got types of food waste through the supply chain, and some of them are easier to manage than others. Some of them don't even exist once you get good data. And so you can imagine this place where if it was on a Gantt chart, God forbid, you're like, this is easy to clean up with a good data understanding. This is easier to clean up with some change in how we do business. But then as you get further down into the waste streams that are actually waste, the challenge of managing those in real time is actually very difficult and can't be solved easily. So we do see hundreds of millions of VC investment into food waste right now, but it's all on front end. So it's all pre-consumer from farm gate, manufacturing, brewing stuff. So very easy to manage uniform waste streams that happen in large volumes, but not the stuff that actually costs us money, that happens, the 60% of food waste that happens on the far end of the supply chain. And so, I think we're running into a sort of sticking point where data is going to be there explaining what we need, but we will not have hardware to deliver on that need.
Yeah, it's so hard to understand. I mean, what goes on in a consumer's home is such a black box, even though we know, at least in high income markets, that's where a majority of the waste happens. There is this cool technology. They're more looking at the restaurant level. Winnow is the name of the company, where they have this AI solution that looks over your trash can and it identifies, and it's basically on top of a scale too. So it actually, as things are going into the trash can, it's identifying what it is and how much is going in. So restaurants at least can actually have some information to learn how to better manage inventory.
It's
who knows?
such an interesting one, then it's we still have to either decide we're going to try to change behavior. We can know what's going in there, but that's different than getting people to change. And there's a question here from Casper about incentives and who actually pays for this. Is it the restaurants that pay for the different infrastructure to get people to put stuff in different bins? Is it the food brands that pay? Is it the corporates that pay? Is it the waste management companies that pay? I don't know, Olympia, what's your view on these kind of sustainability requirements? Who actually pays to make this happen?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because now, as we start to move to more sustainable things, you see people that wouldn't have paid previously paying now. So you're seeing lots of technology that's bringing more of the supply chain in past the farm gate, Prevenir, all those sorts of things that are saying farmers want to own the farm gate, the story past their farm gate a little bit more, and they wouldn't have paid for that historically. It was sufficient to make the farm gate part of their story, and then that was enough. And now it's no, I want more of the supply chain to be stuck inside my farm gate. And then the second part, what we see and what I think is really interesting from any startups out there, or how we think about this moving forward, is this perspective of the technology. So if you say to a restaurateur, you should pay more for wasting food. Not necessarily a terribly great pitch, but that's kind of what's happening right now, which is like, we have a great technology, it's new, it does all these wonderful things. You'll have to pay more than the current system you're using to solve this problem. And they're like, I don't see that value. But if you like Winnow, the point of Winnow is to explain to chefs and the restaurant managers where they're wasting food and where they actually have food waste. So the two things are very different. And so if you can actually get an account of what you're buying and then throwing away, you will make better decisions. And so it's that story that has to be done a little bit better by founders, I think, when we go to bat in the market, because yes, you are going to pay, it's going to be more, but the change and the shift that comes from that data means you don't pay at the other end where you used to pay. So you're just sort of moving the payment up and down, I guess, the supply chain. But that's where I think the socioeconomic stuff's super interesting to me, because education is going to be the core part of new adoption and how we reimagine what we've done. We've always done it this way, and now I have to reimagine why I'm doing things, to bring in new data to make better decisions, to still get the same outcome, but just in a different format. I think that's where this is getting interesting.
Are you, Lachlan, I'm curious if you're kind of having the same conversation around education. Like, do you see that as a big part of what needs to happen here, is changing the conversation and building more awareness around like what is waste, what is sustainable, that kind of thing?
Oh, completely. Because essentially the commodity chain in terms of the value proposition has been, the premium, for want of a better word, is often bastardized, right? So what the farmer gets and what the trade along the way makes from it, right, is something completely different. So that's being valorized in different ways, which probably takes away from that initial, hey, why is the farmer doing this in the first place, to tell a better story about the food that they're producing. And that's being used for marketing purposes, which doesn't always get the result of what was intended, right? So that's one thing. And I know I sound like a broken record here, but this is the whole point to about moving to metrics, where you're actually talking about a CO2e footprint or a water footprint or whatever, rather than another brand in that space, right? Rather than a certification brand in that space. Because if we are able to essentially take away that sort of perception of what something might entail or might not entail, based on a brand that sits on a product, a certification that sits on a product, and turn it into a metric, that will educate people in themselves. I mean, they'll be making the decision, the purchasing decision, for a something that's quantified rather than a perception.
I guess the counterpoint to that, like I can, the one of the challenges with that is we already see it, especially at the consumer level and increasingly at the farmer level, this absolute explosion of different metrics. And so farmers are being asked now to report on 1,700 things, and the metrics platforms might be there, but which ones do they report on and to who? And then consumers are getting, how many hens per hectare and how many, bubbles per milk. Like, there's just too many things out there, and it's organic and now it's carbon. And so I guess there's this, the counterpoint to that maybe would be around metrics overload, and how do you get back to enabling decision-making both at the farm level and at the consumer level? I don't know, Jess, what do you think about the metrics conversation?
I mean, I agree with you. I think, this was attempted in Europe several years ago with the environmental product declarations. They kind of walked that back. They're revisiting it again. I think it's really hard to develop guidelines that apply across like entire sections of the grocery store, for example. And I think, there's, you can use QR codes. There's ways that you could link this information to consumers. A colleague of mine who used to work at a retailer said they did this whole program. They had a QR codes related to sustainable seafood. No one really looked at the QR codes, but when they surveyed people were more likely to buy it because they knew the information was there. And so they felt like it was probably a more sustainable option. And I thought that was just such an interesting because like I don't even read every label. I know, if I'm being honest, like I don't read every label of everything that I buy in the grocery store either. So how could I expect someone who probably is less informed about sustainability to do so? So I do think that, you know, some people are talking about like maybe gamification will get it to work. I don't know how many parts of our life we really can gamify at once. But I mean, I'd like to think we need to make it really easy for consumers. Like we need to give them a better option without them needing to make a million more decisions in the grocery store, and simplify that. I don't think there's a great solution yet though for how we communicate all of that information.
I think some of it
No,
maybe,
I think,
go ahead,
sorry, but I think that's the whole point though. Whilst we're still in where the majority of our, let's call them sub-brands behind products, are about perception rather than metrics, that's a dangerous place to be in, because you don't actually get the impact, right? So long as we can get those, call them sub-brands, underneath the consumer goods, the brands of the actual consumer good, to be metrics based and to be understood to be metrics based, then I think the confidence that was just talked about can actually be delivered. Yeah, and yeah,
I think you're right. It's not necessarily consumers who need to see the data. It's like those credible or the skeptical groups that would dig in and kind of undercut your brand reputation. If you can satisfy them, then like you're building the right amount of trust, perhaps.
But don't we think the challenge around the metrics is that we're not really sure what this is yet? Like an organic product, for example, the metrics are pretty, we understand what the metrics are required to consider yourself organic. But for sustainability, it's so broad right now. Like what is sustainable is such a broad thing that I think that's why we're seeing this sort of confusing pylon of metrics where we're like, it's got to be SDG driven, it's got to be carbon emission sequestration driven, it's got to be this, it's got to be that, and then you must overlay that with emotional in stuff. So grass fed, you know, all these other components of the impression of what sustainability means, right? Which is both driven by economics, but also by social and cultural values. And so I just think we're in this flux part of, which is it's an unhelpful statement, but I think we're in a flux of understanding of what this is going to mean moving forward. And so there's still not a sort of an alignment, I guess, particularly across the FMCG players, to say this equals what we believe delivers to the customer. And so I sort of think about it from some of our waste clients. So we have, if you look at fast food, and I'm just going to precursor this statement by saying, have lots of other issues in sustainability and waste, but in the waste of actual food, fast food restaurants do not waste. McDonald's has figured out how to build a hamburger that is exactly the size that means that people do not eat only a third of a quarter pounder. They eat the entire quarter pounder, they eat an entire box of chips. And so a McDonald's restaurant might waste, you know, less than 20 kilos of actual food a week. That is insane for how much volume goes through a McDonald's restaurant. Fast, fresh restaurants, which we all align with being, you know, very clean and good for us, waste far more than that, because they're trying to cater to you walking up and going, I don't want that part of that, and I'd like you to add this to that, and then I kind of want more of that, and then I want it all fresh. And so they have to do a different thing. And so I think the metrics will start to align once we actually understand where we want our businesses to be. So where farmers are like, no, we're going to be a biodiversity, or this is our play and this is going to be our play. And so then you'll pick and choose the metrics that feed into the FMCG or produce markets from there, instead of trying to be all things to all people, which is what I feel like is happening right now.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. So we've done a bit of research in the bank looking at sort of the top 50 FMCG companies around the world and understanding in their public commitments what their hot topics are. and their carbon, biodiversity, soil health, waste, and what was the other one?
Packaging.
Yeah, that was in the waste space. Sorry, there's one critic. Oh, and in third, and in emerging markets, the whole social element, modern slavery, whether it be labour rights, all that sort of stuff. So I mean, this isn't peer-reviewed perfect research, right? But this is so that we could have a conversation with our clients that, hey, whilst we've got a regulatory element to it, the people that buy your commodities have stated this as what they need to deliver to investors and consumers as well, right? So we see those sort of 5 topics as relatively synonymous, that farmers have to consider, that essentially the top of the supply chain has to deal with, has to start to quantify, and has to start to certify over the next 20 years to meet essentially 80 to 90% of the global agri supply chain.
Yeah, there's the kind of broadening out from waste is maybe a good place to go. There's lots more to talk about on waste. And I'm actually curious what some of your clients are saying in terms of how you sell Apeel. We'll come back to that. There was a question in the chat about transport and logistics. Like, I guess when we think about where some of these costs are and where some of the opportunities are, where are you seeing the kind of next wave? We talked about it being digital first and understanding where waste is, but in terms of the next wave of what problems we can solve, where do you guys see that going? I don't know, maybe Lach, any kind of hints on what's coming next?
I think it's actually sort of in terms of you do across most of the commoditized, your basic animal proteins, grains, oilseeds, etc. The LCA analysis on most of those supply chains shows that still the real waste, or the emissions, or the water footprint, or whatever it is really on farm, right? And that's quite challenging when you're dealing not with a well capitalized corporation, but you're dealing still predominantly with a lot of mum and dad enterprises in the sort of the mature markets. So I think the sort of the real stuff that we've got to work on is, one, methane, if it's animal proteins, 2, volatilization of nitrogen in terms of, and water efficiency. I mean, on farm, if you just look at if you look at from, and it goes back to waste again, because these are inefficiencies in terms of how we apply nutrient, how animals process feed, and also how we use water the most efficiently. Again, it's almost a waste equation. It's a waste conversation again, even though you're trying to steer away from it. But that's another part of food waste that is, just from a pure LCA perspective, is massive. I don't know if the others want to comment on that.
I mean, one area it's relatively small that we see in produce because of its perishability is there are entire supply chains that rely on air freight today to move around the world, which is, I mean, if that's not an inefficiency, like I'm not sure what is. So, I mean, that I see as a massive opportunity. The amount of plastic packaging that's used, and plastic packaging is really tough because, one, if it's preventing enough food waste, some of the environmental costs can be justified. 2, plastic packaging oftentimes is serving so many different functions for the food. So it might be for grouping, as well as protection, as well as shelf life extension. And there's tons of real estate for marketing for all of those different claims you want to make that we just talked about. And so it's hard to create solutions that can actually address all of those functions that would be needed to truly replace or eliminate it. For Apeel, we have one product that we've launched here in the US for long English cucumbers, because they're just wrapped in single-use plastic, just shrink wrapped. And the only thing that shrink wrap is doing really is shelf life extension. So we've actually been able to eliminate that with the use of our product. But admittedly, there are very few examples where it's that straightforward, because the plastic packaging is usually doing so many different things. So, that's obviously, another big area. And then the last area that we're thinking about is the cold chain, and the use of refrigerants are a big environmental hotspot. And are there opportunities for us? There's a lot of technologies to kind of get smarter and optimize our use of the cold chain, but in places where we haven't implemented it yet, where we know in the next 10 years we are going to be, can we think about leapfrogging that with less intensive ways to store and distribute food? So that way we don't, need to develop those kind of emissions intensive infrastructure systems in the first place. So, that's probably, that's a big area that, not one technology is going to solve on its own, but something that could be exciting to look at.
Yeah, for sure. We think about, and we've talked about this before, the intersection of autonomy at the field level with some of this. And if you can even redefine knowing when and how you pick, can you pick more on demand? Can you reduce the need for cold chain? And then can you also have products like Apeels and others in the supply chain to be extending that shelf life without the need for refrigerants or transportation? And to a lot of the points in the chat, how do you do that in a way that doesn't penalize farmers? Like who pays for those technologies? Who pays for that? And how do you make sure there's co-benefits around the productivity gains? So I think there's, no shortage of opportunity areas to be digging into with this stuff. Your point about packaging though just made me, Olympia, can you share, you see the other end of this with what Goterra does, like you see what comes out the other side of this waste conversation. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges there and just how hard it is to, we talked about the sorting at the restaurant level and some of the things that come, but what does that look like? And what do you see are the challenges and opportunities there?
Yeah, so the challenge is that people don't care. And we don't actually realize or have a strong understanding of how much packaging we use at all, period. I think we get incremental insights when we do things like recycle, and we realize that now our general waste bin doesn't have a lot in it. But if you tried to sit down and think about every time you took a piece of plastic off something that was related to food, it gets a little horrifying. It's Friday today, which means it's waste day, where we've already received 6 tons of waste. 40% of that waste will be packaging. And so that's an incredible amount of soft plastics that have nowhere to go. And it's all relative to food, down to the just stupid little things. It's like, why is the chocolate inside the box, inside the plastic, also now inside plastic? And you only think about the fact that that's true when you watch it go through a line and it has to be taken out of all of those parts. So I keep coming back again to this socioeconomic part, because even when we see it in restaurants, the challenge with restaurants, our unit up in Sydney, we've got really great source separating at the back of house for the restaurants. But humans, we are fallible, and we also are, when we're in a rush, our care factor diminishes exponentially. And so you look at back of house operations in busy restaurants, and people who are paid not high wages, their concern about whether or not a chuck swipe or packaging goes into organics waste, it just doesn't exist. And that's okay. But I think the job of that is actually not on the client. I think that's now on the waste management provider, or how we manage waste. And it's the same at the farm gate level. So if the farmer can find better ways to package produce to go to market, that's an innovation that delivers an outcome, right? So reusable or sustainable or compostable, however we want to look at it. But it's then the manufacturers or whoever receives those goods' job to find better ways of handling that packaging and places for it to go. We have to sort of, I don't like this assignment of blame for whoever touched it last. Like, it feels like we're all in a circle going, you touch it. And then whoever's get left holding it at the end is the person that pays. And I feel like instead we have to go, okay, we can make these efficiencies on my end, and when I punt it down the chain to the next person, they're going to find ways to deal with it in their way. And so this custody of the provenance of waste I think is going to start to continue. Well, it will continue to evolve as those technologies come into play and get online. So, yeah, but no, please stop using plastic. Like if you want to get an up close relationship with plastic, feel free to come visit us on a Friday. It's so funny. Like nobody that works at Goterra likes packaging. Like they're all like, ugh. So it's a good breaker to get you out of using plastics.
Olivia, I remember on a flight from Jakarta to Lampung, which is about 20 minutes, the tray that the airline, and I probably can't name the airline, served with, I don't know, a bit of cake or something. I remember counting, they had 17 bits of plastic. So if you do the maths on that in terms of, okay, there's 200 people on each plane they're flying 8 times a day, it's just horrific. And you're sort of like, oh no, I can't eat it. But at the end of the day, it's only going to be pressure on that actual supply chain before that's going to make any difference whatsoever.
Yeah, like once it goes into that cart on that plane, it's going to have been one way or the other. Whether you don't want it or you ate half of it or that plastic is going to landfill. And I think there is this sort of social adoption piece where like my short shower won't save Australia in a drought, but me explaining to everybody that plastic is bad and that I'd prefer stuff not to be in plastic does create momentum around change. And so, but I think it's going to be more around innovations like Apeel, where we can start getting rid of some of this plastic out of our supply chains and that's a great thing for farmers, right? Because if we could add these things, I don't know where we put Apeel in the supply chain, but if we can start doing some of these things at farm gate, then it's kind of out of the rest of the supply chain, right? Because if it's been done at farm gate or very close to, like, why am I adding anything else, right? So
it just becomes a cost for the FMCG, I mean, for no benefit, so they won't do it.
No, they'll be like, oh, it's already sorted. I'm not going to add more to that. So, yeah, I think there's some interesting parts there as we keep moving forward.
Yeah, and that's exactly where we do it at the produce packing house that's co-located with where it's grown. So, yeah, I mean, it makes it easier for that. It's kind of we swap out the plastic and swap in our application systems. I do think going back to kind of the plastic issue, there's like on one end of the spectrum, there's these kind of horrific examples where it's like, why isn't this not changing, right? Like it's like low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better term. And then there's kind of the other end of the spectrum with even some of these big CPG companies are like really have very aggressive like goals to reduce the amount to find the actual compostable plastic. That's debated what that actually means sometimes. But then there are some instances where just the technology is not there yet, like having something that can protect against moisture for certain food types. And like there are some really like hard nuts to crack still, which I think is exciting for like startups to come out or new innovation to address some of those. But then it is baffling, to your point about the airline example, just some of them are just so superfluous. Hard to imagine how we haven't gotten rid of those yet.
Yeah, like we're not getting rid of plastic anytime soon. Like that's just we can't. And I say can't begrudgingly. We should be able to, but like it's not a reality to where we are today. And yes, there are things that do the job well. But if we don't start finding other ways to do it, we are in trouble. And I think that's probably the bigger issue. And so anywhere we can put it further up the food chain so that as it comes through there can be less, I think is the opportunity at the moment.
That kind of ties back to some of the points we were making before around then requirements on farmers. Like, so if we want to move it up the supply chain, you kind of get further away from who might pay for it. And so Ollie had a question around, in New Zealand, they've just introduced mandatory farm environmental plans. And the conversation has been around nitrate leaching and around some of the social license concerns, and we need to clean up our waterways. And so that's led to mandatory reporting. There's also a parallel conversation around, having a plan and thinking about how you'll improve can drive better business outcomes and actually leads to profitability. So I think probably jury's still out, but my sense is there's been a largely positive reaction to having these plans, but it's kind of a slippery slope to imposing requirements on farmers without thinking about the incentives they might get. Lach, you're nodding. Any comments on that?
Yeah, well, this is what we've got a large portfolio in New Zealand, and this is what we're struggling with, because you think, I don't know what percentage of it of New Zealand dairy produce goes to skim milk powder in East and Southeast Asia, but it'd be significant whack. And how do you quantify to the average Southeast Asian consumer who's fairly an East Asian consumer who's fairly price conscious, right? How do you quantify that? You should pay 20 cents extra a kilo to look after New Zealand's waterways, which they would consider probably pretty clean anyway, right? So these are sort of the wicked problems that we've got across commodity chains. But if farmers actually have control of that premium, and that premium's not bastardized through the supply chain, like it's actually a ticket to the product for the FMCG company, then I do, and it's not something that's sort of corrupted and perverted across the supply chain as every different person tries to assign value to it or create more value out of it. I think there might be solutions there, because essentially, one, the consumer knows, all right, there is transparency. It's uncorrupted. I'm paying for what I'm hoping to pay for, and two, it's almost separated from the commodity, right? The commodity is still skim milk powder, but there are these additional co-benefits that are a relatively direct transaction.
We feel like, though, that it's sooner or later, and this is I'm going to wade right into something a bit dangerous here. It suggests that sooner or later we're just going to have to pay for things to be done better.
Oh, I do. I do. It's not but I also think, so what we've found with, and the problem is that it's such a long-term piece. Like, you'll usually, yes, you might get restrictions on your input usage or things like that as a farmer. And because it's regulatory, it's far sharper than the rate of increase in the technological curve. Yeah. Right. So you're, and working out the systems, working out the finance systems or whatever it is that sort of says, okay, well, you're going to have to take the hit now because of regulatory purposes, but probably technology on yield is growing at 3 or 4% compound over 20 years. So you'll probably get back to that similar yield at some time in the future. It's bridging that gap and sort of keeping people in the game and relatively positive and not feeling like they're being whacked for society's ills. Is the bloody tricky bit.
So that gap then, because then that gap then is now on the producer entirely. Yeah. And so, like, is that a policy-driven thing? Like, or is this going to come from corporates? Where does the gap come from?
We promised each other we wouldn't talk about politics before the.
Politics. I'm just asking where the drive comes
No, look, New Zealand and certain parts of Europe have taken a really interesting course, right, in terms of really sort of regulating the way from a top-down level, the way farmers do things and the way farmers can actually farm, right, where apart from sort of sugar farmers along the reef in Australia, we haven't got there yet. The US certainly hasn't got there yet. Latin America hasn't. There are parts of Asia in environmental sensitive zones that have, but generally it's something that we're still absolutely feeling a way in terms of is it a societal right almost to be able to dictate how our food is produced? Why aren't we trusting farmers? So look, New Zealand's certainly a long way down the road in that, and with I don't know, let's call it mixed results at this stage.
Yeah,
I'm curious, Lach, your perspective in Olympia too, if you have one on like the role of retailers and whether Like we see these, buyers and these retail organizations who have so much control over what the incentives are for suppliers to provide, what consumers have access to. They're basically curators of like the food we eat, the products that we can purchase, etc. And yet they're not always part of the conversation around, nor are they often incentivized to prioritize sustainability. So it's something that, I'm curious if there's anything you're aware of that's like been focused on that, or if you've had any experience with that.
I think that's our perception, Jess, right? But still, at the heart of every supermarket, even if they're a multinational supermarket, there's another 2 or 3 other supermarkets they're competing against, and their whole business model is based on having the food available for the consumer, whatever they want. There's never an empty shelf. There's never, and they are so fearful of that, right? In terms of, all right, if we ramp up our compliance, our environmental compliance in terms of what we want, is another supermarket suddenly going to be able to supply the same product, right, for 50% cheaper and have a much more secure supply chain because they're not excluding anybody from the market, right? So whilst it sounds like I'm rooting for the supermarkets here, that is still an absolute problem that they face in fresh produce, right? And so we see with the sort of the implementation of the Modern Slavery Act as federal legislation in Australia over the last 2 years, that and sort of how that impacts on the fresh produce chain, sort of supermarkets have been like, oh, gee, does this mean I actually have to say no to a supplier, right? And so they're dealing, it's one of the most sensitive things they can deal with. So whilst it seems like, from sort of an outside perspective, they may be able to just click their fingers and say, hey, we need X, Y, and Z. And I think you see that a little bit, especially around animal welfare, right? They have actually sort of said, hey, we can't have these risks in our supply chain. We will actually say, no, we'll start to exclude you if you don't get RSPCA certification or whatever it is in certain animal proteins. We will actually... they're still in a brutally competitive environment, which means
that's where like the policy intervention, like you were talking about with the farm, it's kind of the same with the farmers. They're competing against one another too, and that's where like the policy intervention is what can then affect the whole industry, and we see that a lot less. I think aside from this example you just gave, we see that a lot less focused on like that node in the supply chain.
But you can also, we've got anecdotal evidence that it depends. It comes back to the analogy of fast food versus fast fresh and knowing who you are, right? And so we know from our clients that we have supermarket chains who are using the data from their waste management services with us to reduce their amount of waste. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy in supermarkets particularly, and retail of any food, where the client's perception of what good food and fresh food is, so full shelves, is driving decisions by supermarkets. Then they don't cut things and put them in glad wrap because nobody wants them that way, right? Their data on what we're going to buy and how we're going to buy it and what size things we buy is so tight. So we are the ones that are driving these decisions as humans. And they are then supplying us with what we are telling them we want, right? So that's the first like cycle of self-licking ice cream cone. But the second part of that is, if you are a brand that has courage in changing to those things, and so like one of our clients has made a commitment, a commercial commitment to change, you can leverage that courage to change your clients. So you see that with the ugly food movement in Europe, where McDonald's does not apologize that the quarter pounder has nothing left over. It doesn't let you change what it is. It's just unapologetically exactly the same, which is also sometimes a criticism. But I think that same premise can be used in retail, where it's like, we're going to do better for the client, the climate. And that means that as clients, if you come here, these are the changes you're going to have to experience. No plastic bags without being charged, and those sorts of things. And we do see that in our clients once they have data. And we made it all the way back to data at 10 o'clock. So like as soon as they got data that explained just how much of their waste was food and how much of it was coming through, then they could start to make definitive decisions to their logistics and supply chains to either remove some of that or diminish it. And money is the reason in the end, right? That saves them money, but it also drives goodwill, which in turn creates more money. So I think there's ways to leverage, making brand statements about commitments to then create customer change that's needed.
Yeah, I mean, and this is exactly
sorry,
why
I'm going to interrupt you, Jess, just because we're out of time. So I will end it because people have to go. It's some really good stuff and we could get into it a lot more. I would love to actually. But I think it's a positive note to end on. Like, we're not there yet. There are levers. We can't just say it's too hard. We have to get moving, and that happens at all levels of the supply chain. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks Rabobank for sponsoring, and have a great rest of your afternoon, morning, evening. And really appreciate everyone leaning in. Thanks Jess, Olympia, and Lach. And thanks Nat.